strangest thing about Winston Churchill's most famous refusal is this. In the story Churchill later told, the refusal was never even tested. He said the question of whether Britain should keep fighting did not appear on the war cabinet agenda. Not once. But in the National Archives at Kew, there is a gray cardboard folder with a number on its spine, KAB/65/13. Inside are the official minutes from the meetings held between May 26th and May 28th, 1940. 9 meetings, 3 days, 5 men. And page after page shows the same thing. Churchill later tried to smooth out of memory. Britain almost asked Mussolini to help negotiate with Hitler. Not because the men in the room were cowards, because the world outside that room looked finished. On May 10th, the day Churchill became Prime Minister, Germany invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. The British High Command had expected another war of lines and attrition. Instead, German armor moved like a blade through paper. 3 Panzer Corps drove through the Ardennes. They crossed the Meuse at Sedan. By May 20th, German tanks had reached the Channel. The Allied armies were split in two, and the British Expeditionary Force was trapped in a shrinking pocket around Dunkirk. The beach was not a rescue site yet. It was a trap. The big ships could not get close because the water was too shallow. Men waded out into the surf with rifles lifted over their heads. Behind them, the port burned. Above them, the Luftwaffe came in waves. Food was short. Water was short. Discipline was fraying. And the early estimate inside Britain was brutal. Maybe 30,000 men could be saved. Maybe 45,000 out of more than 400,000. That was the situation Edward Halifax was reading on the morning of May 26th. One thing was missing from the dispatches. Hitler had ordered the panzers to stop short of Dunkirk. The tanks that could have closed the pocket had halted. The reason is still argued over. Terrain, command confusion, Luftwaffe confidence, fear of overextension. But the men on the beach did not know the window was open. The generals did not know. The war cabinet did not know. Churchill did not know, and Halifax did not know. He only knew that France was collapsing, the British army might be gone within days, and Britain's bargaining position might never again be this strong. That is what made the argument dangerous. Not that Halifax was foolish. He was not. Lord Halifax was the Foreign Secretary. He was aristocratic, devout, measured, and politically powerful in exactly the places Churchill was weak. The king had preferred Halifax as prime minister. Many conservatives had preferred Halifax. Churchill had been in office for just over 2 weeks, and his authority rested on a very narrow fact. He had warned about Hitler when the others had not. That was enough to give him the job. It was not enough to make him safe. Across the table sat Neville Chamberlain, the former prime minister, still leader of the Conservative Party. 71 years old, hollow in the face, already ill, though he did not yet know how little time he had left. Beside Churchill were Clement Attlee and Arthur Greenwood of Labour. They were for fighting on. Halifax was pressing toward negotiation. Chamberlain was the hinge. 2 against 2. One man between Churchill and political collapse. The crisis began before the formal cabinet fight. On Saturday, May 25th, Halifax met the Italian ambassador, Giuseppe Bastianini. Italy had not yet entered the war. Mussolini was still officially neutral. Halifax treated that neutrality as a possible door. He suggested that if Italy could help bring about a general European settlement, Britain might have to discuss the issues causing Italy anxiety. Everyone in that world knew what that meant. Malta, Gibraltar, Suez. The foundations of British power in the Mediterranean. Halifax was not openly surrendering anything. That was the strength of the move. He was opening a channel that could become negotiation before anyone had to call it negotiation. The next morning, at 9 o'clock, The War Cabinet met. Halifax said they had to face the truth. It was no longer a question of imposing total defeat on Germany. It was a question of safeguarding the independence of the British Empire. Churchill answered that peace under German domination of Europe would be something Britain could never accept. He wanted liberty and independence complete, not partial, not rented back from Berlin, not preserved by asking Mussolini for permission. The morning passed without a decision, but Halifax had not lost. He had only prepared the next move. At 4:30 that afternoon, he brought a formal paper, suggested approaches to Italy, a phrase so clean it almost hides the danger. The paper proposed that Britain and France indicate willingness to consider a European peace through Mussolini. Then Halifax said the line that carried the whole argument. They might get better terms before France left the war and before Britain's aircraft factories were bombed. That was not hysteria. It was strategy. If France fell, Britain stood alone. If the Royal Air Force was smashed on the ground or in its factories, Britain might be unable to defend its cities. If the army disappeared at Dunkirk, there might be no army left to rebuild. Halifax was saying, negotiate while there is still something to trade. Churchill saw a different trap. Once Britain began the approach, secrecy would not stay secret. Hitler would learn Britain was searching for terms. Mussolini would ask for the price. France would hear that Britain was preparing a separate path, and Britain might find itself too far inside the process to turn back without looking broken. To Churchill, the approach was not merely useless. It was deadly. Chamberlain did not fully commit. He opposed the move for the moment, but said the situation could change even within a week. That was enough to keep Halifax alive. 2 against 2. The hinge still open. At Sauzo Nami Bay that evening, Churchill authorized Operation Dynamo. In the tunnels beneath Dover Castle, Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay sent the order. The evacuation began. That night, only Baigi and Sao Chumchi men came off the harbor. Not enough to change the strategic picture. Not enough to prove Churchill right. Not enough to silence anyone. Monday, May 27th, Halifax pushed again. The Italian embassy had indicated Mussolini was prepared to mediate. Halifax framed it carefully. Britain could declare that it would fight to the death for independence, but it could also consider concessions to Italy if independence were preserved. The words were balanced. The implication was not. Britain would place its survival in the hands of a dictator who was already leaning toward Hitler. Churchill refused. Then the argument left the paper. Halifax walked out, not out of government, not yet. Out into the garden behind number 10. Late May light on the trees. Roses coming into bloom. London still not bombed, France already bleeding out, and the most powerful conservative in the government standing outside the room because he could no longer work with the Prime Minister's line. Churchill followed him. The minutes do not record what was said there. Halifax diary and later accounts fill the shape of it. He told Churchill it was becoming difficult to serve. He raised resignation. That was not a private inconvenience. It was a political weapon. If Halifax resigned over peace feelers, the Conservative Party would hear that Churchill had refused even to explore terms. Chamberlain might follow him. A new government could form. A government more acceptable to the party, more acceptable to the palace, more acceptable to the men who had never trusted Churchill in the first place. The legend wants Churchill as iron. The garden shows something more interesting. He did not thunder. He did not crush Halifax. He managed him. He spoke about unity, cabinet responsibility, and the danger of public fracture during war. He bought time. That was all he could buy. One more day. That night, Halifax wrote in his diary that Winston had talked the most frightful rot. The next morning, May 28th, Belgium surrendered. The northern flank disappeared. On paper, this should have been Halifax's strongest hour. France was failing. Belgium was gone. Dunkirk was still uncertain, and Britain's army was still on the wrong side of the water. But out on the coast, something had begun to shift. Cloud and smoke blurred the German aim. The stopped panzers were still stopped. The boats kept coming, not just destroyers, fishing boats, ferries, pleasure craft, anything that could cross the water and come back with men. By the end of May 28th, the evacuation was no longer a rumor of hope. It was becoming a fact. But the War Cabinet did not yet have the full proof when it met again that afternoon. At 4 o'clock, Halifax returned to the point. He insisted that nothing he proposed could remotely be described as capitulation. Churchill replied that the odds of getting decent terms from Germany were 1,000 to 1 against. Still, the arithmetic had not moved, so Churchill did something Halifax had not anticipated. He stopped trying to win the argument in the room of five. At around 5 o'clock, he left the inner war cabinet and went to a larger meeting of ministers, the outer cabinet. About 25 men were waiting to be briefed. Churchill did not give them comfort. He told them the disaster in France might become the greatest military defeat Britain had suffered for centuries. He told them negotiation had been considered. He told them what Germany would likely demand: the fleet, the bases, the things that made Britain a power. Then he gave them the line that changed the room. If the Long Island story was to end, he said, let it end only when each of them lay choking in his own blood upon the ground. The room rose. They cheered him. Some crowded around and touched his shoulder as they left. It was not just emotion, it was political force. Churchill had found the majority that did not exist inside the five. He had gone outside the narrow arithmetic and brought back a larger mandate. When he returned to Halifax and Chamberlain, he told them he had never heard men in high office express themselves so emphatically. The argument had changed shape. Halifax could still speak, but he could no longer claim the government was quietly with him. Now Chamberlain moved. On a dispassionate survey, he said, the alternative to fighting on involved a considerable gamble. That sentence mattered because of who said it. The man of Munich, the man associated forever with appeasement. The man who had come home in 1938 speaking of peace for our time. That man looked at Halifax's path and called it the gamble. The count became 3-2, Churchill, Attlee, Greenwood, and now Chamberlain. Halifax stood alone. He protested that his proposal was not capitulation. But the hinge had closed. The War Cabinet set further discussion of negotiation aside. Officially, the fight was over. The next day, May 29th, proof arrived from Rome. Sir Percy Lorraine, the British ambassador, reported after contact with Count Ciano, Mussolini's foreign minister. Italy was going to enter the war. Only the date remained uncertain. Mussolini would not listen to French offers. Not even if France offered its Mediterranean territories. The mediator Halifax had hoped to use was not a mediator. The neutral was not neutral. The door was not a door. It was a wall painted to look like one. If Britain had approached Italy, it would have signaled desperation to Berlin, weakened France, exposed division inside London, and received nothing. No terms, no channel, no safety. Churchill had called it a deadly danger. Within 24 hours, the telegram showed why. Then Dunkirk changed everything the room had feared. On May 29th, roughly 50,000 men were brought home. More came on the 30th, more on the 31st. On May 31st alone, more than 68,000 men crossed back to England. By the time Operation Dynamo ended on June 4th, Bacham-Bamatamgan, Hicham-Himasao Allied soldiers had been rescued. They came back without their tanks, without their artillery, without most of the heavy equipment that makes an army. but the men were alive, and that meant Britain still had the human core of a force it could rebuild. That is why the war cabinet argument was never only about one island. If Britain had sued for terms, there is no secure base for the United States in Europe. No later return across the Channel in the same form. No D-Day as the world came to know it. The Soviet Union faces Germany without Britain holding open the western edge. The entire shape of the century bends, and it bent for 3 days around a cabinet table, around Halifax caution, around Churchill's risk, around Attlee and Greenwood holding steady, around Neville Chamberlain, sick and fading, crossing to the side history did not expect him to take. Chamberlain left the war cabinet in October. He died in November 1940. Halifax was sent to Washington in December, after Chamberlain's death had reduced the danger he posed at home. Churchill had kept him close as long as the arithmetic required, then moved him across the Atlantic. Attlee remained. 5 years later, in July 1945, the British people removed Churchill from office and made Attlee prime minister. The quiet man in the corner outlasted the giant in the posters. And Churchill? He won the war. Then he wrote it. In 1948, at Chartwell, he began shaping the history the world would inherit. When he reached those May days, he gave the argument one sentence. The question of fighting on, he wrote, never found a place in the war cabinet agenda. The folder at Q says otherwise. Cab/65/13. Meetings 139 through 145. The paper is plain. The language is official. No drums. No legend. Just minutes, memoranda, and the record of a government that almost stepped toward negotiation because the facts looked unbearable. That is what Churchill hid beneath the cleaner story. Not that he was weak, not that he wanted peace, but that his finest hour was not a statue standing alone in a storm. It was a man with 17 days in power, little party trust, and one dangerous rival, trying to keep a room from turning against him long enough for the tide at Dunkirk to change. History remembers the bulldog, the file remembers the vote, and the most frightening part is not that Churchill won. It is how close he came to losing before most of Britain even knew there had been a fight.